podcast, Journey to Life, with my co-host, Constance Fields, and yours truly, ArletteJones-Lawson. Our topic today is adverse childhood experiences and effects on health. And we are honored today with our very special guest, Isabelle Valeus. Thank you so much, Isabelle. Appreciate your presence.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited that you're here, and we're really interested in you sharing the effects that adverse childhood experiences has on our health. So, Mom, do you wanted to ask the first question?
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about adverse childhood experience, and I think you have a survey that you were wanting to share with us.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. To start with, I think the best way to kind of give you an idea what adverse childhood experience survey experiences are is to maybe take the survey. It's a 10-question survey. And as I read the questions, or if you're looking at it, you just answer yes or no. And at the end of that, we add up the scores and it'll be out of 10. So if I can just kind of read over each of the questions, and you can take note, just, even on your fingers, count one for each yes answer you have. The first question is, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that makes you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Number two, did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Number three, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way, or tried to, or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal sex with you? Four, did you often feel that no one in your family loved you, or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Five, did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Six, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Seven, was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes or often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? Number eight, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, or who used street drugs? Number nine, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? And question number 10 is, did a household member go to prison? And so, when you answer these questions, that gives you an idea what your score would be. And it would be, out of 10.
Wow. I had a question about that. So is it, I know when you have siblings, is it uncommon for siblings to have different scores? For one to score pretty high on the abuse number and one to score lower?
That's a good question. I personally did the survey and I took it, and I did it with my two of my brothers. And it was funny that we had different scores. We grew up in the same household. And part of it had to do with our perception of what was considered, abuse or not. Part of it had to do with our memory, how we remember certain things. And part of it had to do with some of us had certain experiences and some of us did not. In a household, a girl might have been abused, or the boy might have been abused, and the girl was not. So it is very common that you may have different experiences, even though you're in the same household. So that was a very good question.
Yeah, and I appreciate your answer to that, because a lot of times family members, especially siblings, find it hard to believe that their other sibling is feeling like they grew up in an abusive home and they don't feel like the same. And so sometimes it can make you know, it can kind of discount the one that feels like they've been more abused than the other. And it's just really important for people, I think, to understand that you can score very differently and it doesn't discount the experience that anyone has. So that's a powerful survey. Wow.
Yeah, I think that something that you said really underscored the point to me, and that was we all have different experiences, different lived experiences, and different relationships with our parents. You know, that's why, you know, they say like the oldest child in a family gets the brunt of something and the baby gets away with everything, you know? So it's true. But I was curious what your definition of trauma is.
That's a good question. Actually, what you guys have just talked about kind of leads to what, you know, how we define trauma. And so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, it's SAMHSA for short, they define trauma in 3 E's. So they talk about results of events, series of events, or set of circumstances. And the second E is experience as physically, emotionally harmful, or threatening. And it has lasting effects, which would be the third one, on functioning or well-being. So which kind of goes to your own perception, you know, the importance that your perception of having experienced the trauma makes it traumatic. It's not someone else's definition of that, if that makes sense, which goes back to the first question about, you know, the fact that 2 children can be in the same home and have different experiences of trauma, not just the fact that they actually experience it, but their perception of it as well. Explain.
Yeah. What about the different layers of trauma? You know, if you are witnessing something traumatic happen to your sibling, you then have like secondhand trauma. Isn't that what it's called?
Yep. Yeah. So there is also the idea that the trauma that you perceive from someone else, sometimes even let's say even newscasters, they can be traumatized from having seen so much, or even seeing the trauma from, and it's amazing how it could still affect you, the person who's perceiving it, just as difficult, just as bad per se, as the person who experienced it as well.
Yeah.
Great answer. Thank you. And I imagine that there are different types of trauma. Can you elaborate a little bit on the different types of trauma that exists?
Of course. You know, this is probably a good time for me to kind of, before I go into the different types of trauma, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, when we start talking about trauma, that could become traumatizing for people. So if you are listening to this or viewing this and you find that this could cause, you know, re-traumatization, I invite you to take the time, separate yourself, take a break, take a breather, you know, just take care of yourself. At the end of the day, we don't want to talk about trauma and then it kind of flares up old experiences and then you're not getting the help. So please be sure to seek out any necessary help you need at that. So, but to go back to definition of, the different types of trauma. So we just talked about the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. And that one, so in 1995, between 1995 and 97, the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, they took on this huge survey. It had like 2 waves of participants. There were like 17,000 participants in that survey. And they wanted to see what effects adversities in childhood had on experiences. So this is where that survey came in that we did at the beginning. And this is called adverse childhood experiences. So that's one type of trauma. There's been numerous studies. So, you know, not every trauma is going to be discussed. Of course, the ACEs will discuss a little bit more, you know, it's broken up into like, you know, physical abuse, neglect, and other household problems. But there's also other things that are happening like bullying or peer victimization. Those are other traumas. Community violence or exposure to violence. Poverty. Poverty can be seriously traumatic as well. So all of these are different traumas that we experience and that have different effects on us.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Did you have a question, Paul?
Well, I wanted to ask, and I think this ties into what you were saying, Isabel, in terms of like podcast, not podcasters, uh, what are they called?
Newscasters?
Newscasters
Okay.
also having the potential of being traumatized as well from all of the stories that they do. And I guess that ties more into like community violence exposure, maybe.
That could be a part of it. Yes, yes, community violence exposure. Just, secondary trauma, again, is just, you're experiencing the trauma secondhand, and it still has that, effect on you. And so whether it's a newscaster or a police officer or everyone, they didn't experience the shooting, but they've seen so much of it that it starts to affect them. And it can have some devastating effects later on if it's not dealt with.
Yeah. It's kind of like watching a news report as a regular citizen that affects you, even though you've never had that kind of experience, or you don't have anybody deeply connected to you that would have experienced that. But it's just, I think a lot of people who are more sensitive to that sort of thing can be impacted in that way.
If you remember back in, September 11th, right? I'm not sure, Constance, you were old enough at that point, but I remember that time. I wasn't in New York. I wasn't anywhere near it. I don't know anyone who was there, but that experience was traumatizing for me, especially kind of seeing it over and over on the news and then talking about it. And I think, I can't say everyone in America at that time was traumatized, but I want to say a good deal of people had such severe reaction to that. A lot of people were seeking help during that time, because even though we didn't experience it, not everyone knew someone that dealt with it, but it could be very impactful.
Right. Wow. And I actually was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened. Okay. And so even to this day, when I watch videos around September 11th, I cry. And I get like, the pain is still there. So I would imagine that, that's true for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Are there other ACEs studies?
There are. So, when I talked about the original ACE study, we had like 17,000 participants. They found that with the 17,000, they found that about 67% of the population had at least one ACE. Imagine and if you generalize that, remember 67% of, we're gonna just stick to, the United States, having had at least one ACE. And then they said 1 in 8 people had at least 4 of them. So then now, when you go down and break it up to different populations, so sometimes you find higher ACEs in different populations. And so there's been thousands of ACE studies since 1995. And some of them, like I said, they'll vary a little bit, in terms of what questions they're looking at. There's one study that had 101 women that were in the foster care system, and they found that they had about 56% had some kind of ACEs, they had more ACEs in psychological distress, but 97% of those had at least one, whereas we just said 67% in the general population, and then it was 70% of these women had at least 5 or more, and 33% had even 8. There was another study with 800 adults in rural population, and it was like 62% had one ACE, and 15% or more had more. So there's a lot of different studies. And another one with, I love working with veterans, and so and I'm very passionate about kind of looking at how that affects them. So when this one study of 898 veterans, they did at one of the clinics, they found that 85% had at least one ACE, and then 70% of them had 2 or more ACEs. So it varies.
It's interesting how it can affect different populations of subgroups of people, and how the numbers can vary and be very similar in terms of the total, based on the different subgroups.
Yeah, that was going to be my next part of my next question really was, do you find that there's more, there are more populations that experience this more than others, or is there a single population that experiences this more than others?
So, it's a tough question to answer. Is it that, is it, okay, because you're a veteran, do you have more ACEs? Or, so we know that the people, who've gone to jails and prisons, they've got significantly high ACEs. Is one correlated to the other? I like to think that because of the adversities, one tends to kind of go a different way, right? So if as a child you experience a lot, it's very likely that you may get involved with the criminal justice system, right? Because it's not dealt with. As a child, you had a lot of, as childhood, it's likely that you kind of running away from the problem, you join the military. So the question is, does everyone in the military have more ACEs? Absolutely not. Do everyone in the justice system, are they there because they had trauma? No. But there is a high correlation with, ACEs. And so there was actually the one study where this was a systematic review, and the authors looked at 11 other studies, and they found that the more ACEs you had, the likelier the chances of having gotten involved with the justice system. So it was just like there was a correlation. And so they wasn't like, they weren't looking at one study, they're looking at lots and lots of studies, and there's always been this correlation. The more adversities you had in childhood, the more likely you may have negative outcomes.
It's interesting. I'm curious about like in a family, if you have somebody who experienced some childhood abuse, and the other children in the family also experienced abuse as well, how it's possible that one person goes on to be successful and do other things, and then maybe the others don't, or maybe a couple make it out and then the others don't. What are your thoughts about that?
It happens. It happens a lot. Whereas, in some of them, even some who've had even more severe abuse in a family and then go out and they succeed. A lot of it has to do with just your own self perseverance, per se. We use the term resilience a lot. How resilient one is. But a lot of that, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more later on, is just the relationship. So a child growing up in a home that has abuse, neglect, may develop other kinds of relationships outside. You find one teacher that supports and believes in you. You find one other adult that's there and kind of get through it, and you go and succeed. Whereas your sibling may not have had that. So a lot of it has to do with your own personal resilience, but also just resources outside of the home.
Wow, thank you for that. That was a very clear and easily understood explanation. And it doesn't speak poorly of the one that that made that decided to go the way that that they got involved in negative options, as opposed to the one that got involved in more positive options. Sometimes it's just, like you said, it's just kind of, what is the motivating tool? You know what I mean? What is it? Is it, I know I talk a little bit about it in my book that, when you're abused, your behavior changes. And sometimes, you turn to, alcohol or drugs to ease the pain. But other times you can become overachievers, and and just I'm gonna be an A student. I'm gonna everybody's gonna love me because I am just like, now I'm gonna not disappoint anybody. And then you are successful, but you still are dealing with the trauma, and still there's a need to heal from the trauma, because the motivation behind it is what needs to be dealt with.
Even that is a trauma response, going, the extreme opposite. I'm going to be like a straight A. I'm going to
Yeah.
be a high flying doctor. Yeah.
Mhm.
Gabor, I think his name is Gabor Mate. He's one of the most renowned people who talk about trauma and trauma responses. He even talks about how a lot of doctors are that way. Everybody has experienced trauma in some way, and it's just what direction you take it and what extreme you take it, and healing from that. It's so
Absolutely.
fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's fascinating. So, Isabelle, what is toxic stress?
And this kind of leads to what you guys are talking about. So, there's a lot of different traumas, and then, it's like, well, what happens? What happens to the body? And so toxic stress is actually when stress response is activated. So, any kind of stress, we have that fight, flight, or freeze kind of response, right? So it gets activated. And when we experience stress, when a child experiences stress, and it is responded to, they respond to it appropriately, then the body goes back to normal. So, it's like you hear this noise and you thinking it's a snake, right? And it's dark. And then you turn on the light and you're like, oh no, it wasn't a snake. It was just, one of the kids' toys on the floor. So the moment like you were responding really, but then once you see it, you calm down, everything is fine. The child's the same way. They don't know how to kind of respond to that, but an adult comes, they're like, it's okay, you're fine, there's nothing to be afraid of. They're good, their body goes back to normal. That's the normal functioning, all of us. When it's not dealt with, when you continue to, receive the abuse or neglect, or the stress response is not, mediated, then your body response stays activated. So then that's when it leads to toxic stress. When the body is overloaded and the developing system is just not responding the way it should, and that results in toxic stress.
What are some of the possible effects of toxic stress?
So there is plenty of effects, and there's so many of them, and I won't go too much into them. But one of the things that happens in the brain is that we use the amygdala more, where your that amygdala is like the back part of the brain that responds to fight or flight. It's overactivated. And so you're not really thinking much, you're just kind of always going. But then the thinking part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, it's underactivated. So we're not really thinking as much. And then the part of our brains that kind of rationalizes things, the interior circulation, the emotional regulation is also underactivated. So sometimes our emotions are not quite reacting as it should when you see the person. It's like, well, why are you acting like this when that happened? It's not that serious, but they're overactivated in the emotion response. They're not thinking clearly always because that's underactivated as well. But the fight, flight, or freeze responses in our that gets overactivated as well.
So what would you say is the most important way to combat toxic stress?
So, and there's, a video on the side that you can take a look at later on, but the most important response is really having positive relationships. It's, the person, like, we said before, the child who's gone through stuff and then, did not have anyone at home to turn to, but they have this teacher or this coach or, the pastor at the church, anyone who takes an interest to kind of develop that relationship, help them build the resilience, help them believe in themselves. And so having that positive relationship is really most important. So, and that's why I think it's important, as a social worker, it's like to learn to even be that relationship. You can help heal that relationship within someone, even for that short time, to learn to kind of not re-traumatize them and help them to build on that as well.
And I think I really appreciate the career choices that both of you ladies have made, because the population as a whole, we're starting to understand or accept that mental illness is real and that trauma is real, and people's need to heal is important to really every aspect of their life. And, you know, and I think it's really important, especially with folks that don't have what I call my safe space people, to have somebody like, you know, the two of you to be able to help be that safe person that can kind of walk them through their healing process and to help them kind of face, you know, whatever traumas and interpret the traumas that they've experienced, because a lot of times people don't realize that something traumatic was actually happening to them, and sometimes talking it through with a professional helps them to understand why they feel a certain way when in certain situations, when in their mind they've never been traumatized. But, you know, being able to talk to a professional and kind of work through that can kind of help connect the dots, I think. And then the acceptance and the acceptance of the need to heal. And so I think that you know, I'm just so appreciative of what, you know, the fields that you all have chosen to go into. I just think it's the time is now. I think that people are really appreciating the impact that you ladies have, and, you know, and your fellow professionals, and the importance of it. So yay, thank y'all.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to break it up a little bit to just throw that out there.
Well, thank you for saying
Absolutely.
that.
Thank you.
I did want to like shift gears really quick. I know we were just talking about ACEs and we kind of started talking about, excuse me, we started talking about toxic stress. But I wanted to ask you what the impacts are of ACEs.
So yeah, and I talked a little bit about the fact that, you know, when we have adversities, our brain kind of changes, you know, it shifts to, you know, the bottom thinking, like, you know, the bottom part of our brain thinks, you know, primarily rather than the top part of our brain. And so once we kind of, the more adversities we experience, and then of course that leads to, you know, toxic stress if it's not dealt with. But there's a lot of, when we combine the adversity, and then that leads to a lot of toxic stress, that also leads to a lot of adversity that we can talk about some of the consequences of those as well.
That leads right into the consequences of toxic stress and adversities. Yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about that, that'd be wonderful.
Of course. And you know, there's a whole lot that I don't want to go into too much, you know, kind of bore you, but, you know, understanding that the more adversities we experience that are not dealt with, and then we tend to experience toxic stress if we don't deal with it. But there are some consequences. There's some behavioral consequences. Like someone who's had a lot of toxic stress may have an increased risk-taking behaviors, may be aggressive, may be involved in crimes and violence, which we know why we see that a lot of those in the justice system may have had a lot of adversities growing up, difficulties in relationships, as well as they may develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which we hear about a lot. Just how, you know, at times there's just different responses to the brain, and we develop, and it's really difficult to treat for PTSD. You definitely need some treatment, you know, to deal with that. But that's one of the responses. There's some neurobiological responses where the structure and the function of the brain changes, like we talked about. So there's differences in brain development, and it's also been associated with the decrease in the cognitive functioning, and then executive functioning and stuff like that. There's physical problems, which we, if you look at the slides later, you see all the possibilities. You know, children, they may have failure to grow, reduced brain volume, and there's also a lot of physical problems like ear infections, viral infections, asthma, even dermatitis that's associated with that. And there's a lot of adult chronic conditions like cardiovascular disease, stroke, cancer. These are all associated with toxic stress.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of the trauma can store in our bodies. And I've heard this before, that it can come out in different ways, like cancer, like, you know, stomach ulcers and all sorts of things, migraines and things of that nature. And you may have thought, oh, well, I'm over whatever happened to me, but your body is telling you something completely different. So, it's very interesting, what you're saying there. And I know as a new helping professional, new to the community as a counselor, there's a lot of talk about trauma-informed care. And I was thinking about this earlier, how, not every counselor is trained specifically in trauma, but you do have some counselors that are. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to have trauma-informed care?
Absolutely. And it's a good question, because I remember when, so I started my doctorate program, and it's a trauma-informed care program. And then I was like, it's like you've heard of it, but really learn and study it. When I graduated my master's back years ago, we weren't talking about trauma-informed care. So in some ways, we were incorporating it as a social worker. There's a lot of the ethics, that are trauma-informed, but we weren't specifically talking about it. So then I've learned so much about it, and I'm still learning about it, for the record. But one of the things in terms of trauma-informed care is, again, SAMHSA, which the Substance Abuse Mental Health Agency we talked about, they have a lot of information on that. But trauma-informed care, they talk about like 4 R's, right? So just any agency or people you're dealing with, you want to make sure that they, in you yourself, are you realizing the impact of trauma? That's one of the R's. Another R is recognizing the signs of trauma. We talked about some of that before. A lot of the defense mechanisms, you talk to someone, why do they always have an attitude? There's a, common saying is that, don't ask what is wrong with you, but really what happened to you. So it's like, what is going on? What happened that's causing this reaction? Another R is respond to trauma by integrating it in daily practice. So, as the provider you're seeing, see how they're reacting, how they're treating you and the other people, even their staff. And then the last R, I think it's probably one of the most important ones, is resisting re-traumatization. If your professional provider is going to cause more trauma, and sometimes they're not aware, the things that they do that could be re-traumatizing, then that's a problem. So you want to be, I have to be, making sure I'm not re-traumatizing someone I'm dealing with, not meaning to, obviously, but some of the things we say and do can be re-traumatizing. So these are important to kind of remember in terms of trauma-informed care.
Okay, and those are the guiding principles, right? For
these are
treatment.
Those are some of the principles. We also have some other guiding principles for trauma-informed care. That's like safety, peer support, trustworthiness and transparency, collaboration, neutrality, empowerment, voice, choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues are the things to consider.
Thank you.
Would you go into detail on the importance of the trustworthiness and transparency? Because that sounds like that's just like really important, but kind of overlooked.
Absolutely. And again, this is a lot of these principles are things that can be incorporated in a practice, in the doctor's office and stuff like that. But, in terms of counseling with someone, being, when I'm sitting with someone, talking about them, I want to be transparent, and that's one of the reasons, a lot of times I would tell you, I'm going to tell you what we talk about is confidential. However, there is a possibility that I may have to involve someone, and I say that, as transparent as I can. And if I have to call the authorities for whatever reason because of safety issues, being transparent about that is important. Being that I'm trustworthy, when I'm talking to you, that I'm not just going to make something up, that I'm really trying to know what I'm saying is based on best practices, but it's also that I'm not going to lie to you and just so being transparent. And so you want to make sure the people you're seeing, even in again, when we're talking to others, whether or not you're a professional counselor or not, you're helping someone out, whether it's a child who's been traumatized, you want to also show transparent, be transparent and be trustworthy in those as well. So.
And it sounds like, these guiding principles, kind of the end result is to empower and to give voice to the traumatized person. And I mean, that's one of the principles that you listed, and that just seems like, like the ultimate, you know what I mean? If you can give somebody voice to their experience and empower them to own what's happened to them, and to recognize that somebody else's experience, though not the same, doesn't negate theirs,
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you think about what trauma does, it takes the power away from someone, right? Whether it's as a child, as an adult, you've been traumatized, you lost power. You did not have control of what happened to you. And so, as in any kind of relationship, you want to kind of put that power back into the individual's hands. You want to help them to kind of be able to go, make their own decisions, and then help empower them to kind of do for themselves. So rather than doing something for them, you can support them in doing something for themselves. Rather than making the phone call, you can kind of encourage, like, hey, I'll be there with you as you make that phone call. Just kind of giving the voice. It's like, hey, it might be difficult right now to kind of really assert yourself, but let's work on that. Let's try to kind of help you to be able to gain that power, to have the voice and choice. It's like, it's not just taking away the choice from some. Even as our children, we start to kind of teach them. It's like, okay, well, I'm giving you two choices. You still make the choice, whereas, guide them. But we want to start to kind of empower everyone who's kind of been traumatized to go beyond feeling helpless to being able to kind of stand for themselves again. So that's important.
Yeah, it's like empowering them with the tools necessary to, kind of you walk beside them as kind of a guiding force, but to give them the power and the control and the confidence, really, to be able to move forward in the steps that will help them to heal from their traumatic experiences. So it sounds powerful. So Isabelle, what are some of the organizations or resources that are available out there?
So there's a lot of resources that we can use, and we've talked a lot about different trauma and stuff like that. So one of the resources I found very helpful is the Trauma Survivors Network, and they've got like lots of organizations and other programs that can help you connect to services. It helps you they have like the Transnational Cancer Institute. Over there, they've got the American Psychiatric Association. So they have links. So if you go into the Trauma Survivors Network, they've got links to a lot of resources you can connect to. And one of the resources I always tell everybody is the crisis line, the suicide prevention crisis line. They're 24 hours. You can call anytime to be able to connect with someone. They have sent out help. They'll be there. They have someone to talk to anytime. So to always make sure, you're connecting with that, I think it's important.
Well, with the, I know that, we've all just kind of lately seemed to hear more and more stories of people who are choosing to take their own life. And it seems like it's becoming so prevalent that I'm concerned that, that we may start getting kind of numb to it. And I think that what you said is very important. The suicide hotline, I think, is very, important for people to know that is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and and to just reach out, and that's a safe space, and that the folks that are manning those lines are actually there to help, and to help you be able to, I guess, come to a place where you can at least get out of that moment that you feel like that's your only choice. because, you know, it rains, but the sun does come out. You know, we experience nights, but the day always follows. I mean, and it's always going to be, it's always going to be an opportunity to for things to get better. So I think that those resources that you named are very instrumental in helping people to, you know, to get past that moment that they feel that, you know, taking their life is the only choice. So I appreciate that. And we will be making the resources available on our YouTube channel, Journey to Life podcast YouTube channel. And we will also be making Isabelle's powerful PowerPoint presentation today available on our website as well for those that are listening that have that don't have the benefit of hearing our podcast and being able to see it. You'll be able to, we'll make the link available so that you can have access to the PowerPoint presentation. And like I said, it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, and informative. And I think that it can be life-changing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Isabelle, we've been so grateful to have you on today. Is there anything else you'd like to share or add that you didn't get an opportunity to say today?
No, I really enjoyed spending time with you ladies. You definitely made it easier to kind of sit and talk. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you all about trauma. I think it's really an important topic that we don't often discuss. I believe that there's a lot that we can do as individuals, not necessarily professionals, to help those around us. Mm-hmm. At the very least, connect them with someone, whether it's in the church or in therapy or anything like that. I also want to give you the phone number if you're listening and you're not able to see it. The number for the suicide prevention hotline is 1-800-273-8255, 1-800-273-8255. And if you're a veteran, you press 1. They'll connect you to others who works with veterans specifically. And then a final thing is just, you know, building positive relationships. And then taking time out for meditation. It is a wonder how much, you know, just taking that time to kind of reflect and think or not think, you know, those are important as well to kind of help you deal with whatever may be coming. But most importantly, reach out, be a friend to someone, be a peer to somebody else. So thank you, ladies, so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are so honored and excited for our listeners to gain the benefit of this really important, impactful conversation. So thank you again. And Constance, you want to close us out?
Oh, well. All right. Well, this has been another wonderful episode of Journey to Life, and we will look forward to being back with you for the next episode. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.